Hi, it's Bighara here with another installment of my video blog. Haven't done one in a little while, and today I thought I'd talk about something a little different. Normally I talk about D&D and classic D&D and sometimes the retro clones. Sometimes I do a review. Today I was going to talk about a different game that's not D&D and is not a variation of D&D, although it is a fantasy role-playing game. And that is Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. Now, for those of you who have been gaming for a while, you probably remember that Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay came out back in the 80s and was from Games Workshop and was a slightly different take on the fantasy role-playing game, even though it had a lot of very similar elements compared on the surface with something like Dungeons and Dragons. You had monsters like orcs and goblins, you had wizards, you had halflings, you had dwarves, you had elves, so forth and so on. But it was all set in Games Workshop's classic fantasy setting, the Old World, as they called it, which was sort of a pseudo-Renaissance Europe and was much darker and grimmer kind of a place. This was a world where chaos, and this was chaos in a more Moorcockian sense, if that's a word, like Michael Moorcock, the sort of the primal entropy, not chaos like chaotic good, had essentially infested and infected the world. And you had all sorts of things going on, like mutations, demons, various monsters that were in league with chaos, as well as people who worshipped the dark gods, the ruinous powers, what have you. And the thing was, in a sense, the tone of this was sort of what I like to call a rage against the dying of the light, based on the Dylan Thomas poem. But in fact, I think in later editions they actually quoted that line. But I've always thought it applied. Basically what it meant was, in a sense, the world was doomed. It was screwed. There was no way to save the world as the way they had it written. The idea was it was just this conflict. It was dark. The best you could hope to do was to sort of make your own way and possibly help slow down the ultimate corruption or destruction of the world. So it was very, very dark compared to something like Dungeons and Dragons settings and stuff where you were dealing with things more like Greyhawk or Forgotten Realms or things like that, which I'm not saying never had anything at all dark or creepy or grim about them, but by default they tended to be a more optimistic setting where your characters could be more heroic and save the day, rescue the princess, whatever it was. In Warhammer, there were a couple things working against you on that. One was, of course, like I say, the nature of the setting, and the other was the fact that, on average, your character was a lot less powerful, at least in the sense of you weren't going to get to some point in your adventuring career where you were really so powerful that you weren't still pretty vulnerable. I loved Warhammer. I thought it was so cool. Even though I never really played the fantasy battle game or the 40k miniatures game, I always thought it was just such a neat idea. I owned several of the first edition books, and this edition was all there was for years and years. It was quirky, and it wasn't the absolute best written game ever. There were certain elements of it where I felt like they were sort of borrowing ideas from the war game, and they never fully explained them in role-playing game terms. But it was so rich in its flavor, and it was so rich in its tone that it was just a great fun to read and to play and to look at. Of course, there were the infamous critical hit charts, where you had marvelous things, which legs getting severed, tendons being crushed, arteries exploding. It was a game where you sweated every copper piece, and you were gonna get mutated, go insane, die horribly. Something was going to happen, and you just did what you could in the meantime. There's somebody on the internet once had a saying about Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, which I don't remember who originally coined the phrase, but I always enjoyed it. It was Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay was the game where your players think they're playing Dungeons and Dragons and find out they're playing Call of Cthulhu. And I thought that was a pretty neat summation of it. There was a lot of hokey stuff in it too. There were some horrible puns and the atrocious pseudo-German they used for the language. A lot of that was carryovers from the war game. A lot of that was just stuff they wrote. Other things that were interesting about it is where you had there was gunpowder. That's what I was going to say. So you had things like blunderbuss or a flintlock pistol. It wasn't, obviously things like machine guns, but there were guns, and so it was D&D with guns to a certain degree. You also had things like wizards who could do magic, but really were not necessarily well received. A lot of people figured if you could cast a spell, you were a witch and a heretic and should be burned at the stake, and didn't matter if you had a license saying you were legit. The most a peasant or something would kill you, and your magic wasn't strong enough that you were going to fight off an entire village of peasants as a rule. Brief bit of history, that was the game for years and years. It went from a couple publishers to another under license from Games Workshop and languished for a long time. And then a few years back, Black Industries, which was part of the Black Library, the people who do some of the Warhammer and Warhammer 40k novels, published a second edition, and it was revamped. It was, Green Ronin Publishing had a hand in that. It was some of the mechanics were cleaned up and so forth. And when this came out, again, really excited, but also a little nervous that they were going to mess it up, and was incredibly pleased. If anything, I liked the second edition better than the first in terms of playability of the game. In some ways, it became a little less deadly, but at the same time, it was something where, characters could die very easily. They can go insane, undergo mutations, all sorts of things like that. Recently, within the last couple of years, they released a third edition under Fantasy Flight game, which is in a box set. I've not played it. I've seen a demo of it. It holds true to a lot of the stuff set down in the second edition, but it's a little more board game-like in its feel, and frankly, I think it's about $100 retail for the box set, and I have many of the second edition and quite a few of the first edition books, which I find eminently playable, and I really have no desire to go to the third edition. The other thing about Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay I was going to say real quick, and this is true in every edition that I've looked at or seen, and the crown jewel of this, one of the greatest pieces of this game, was its career system, which was an interesting take on something other than just classes, where you're just a fighter. Magic is the idea of progressing from sort of like one class to another, where you have a career, and you have a starting career, and you might start off with something very humble, like and the classic reference is always to things like the rat catcher. And yes, you could start play as a rat catcher. But your career each career has things that it offers you that you can do to improve yourself. You can get stronger, a little bit stronger in this career, or maybe a little bit quicker, or learn this skill, or so forth and so on. And once you've moved through that career to the point where you've basically learned at least a certain amount and gotten a certain amount of experience, you were eligible to go to what was called the career exits, where you could move on to another career. Some of these were sort of, from an adventurer's perspective, sort of a lateral move, where it wasn't necessarily something that was much more powerful or anything like that, but maybe had slightly different focus. You could also spend extra experience and move to another career without completing the current one. Eventually, you would get enough where you could potentially move to an advanced career. Advanced careers were things where in the case of spellcasters you might be able to cast more powerful magic. In case of combatants you might have more skills or talents or better ability with weapons in combat and so forth. So you had this great branching tree where you could improve your character in lots of different ways, but it wasn't something where you could just keep jumping from one thing to another, because you would end up taking longer and longer to get to those areas where you would start to really, really improve. But you could, if that's the way you wanted to go. Really, really thought the career system was awesome. The old world, or anybody who's played Warhammer Fantasy Battle, is a setting as detailed as any fantasy setting out there. It's had scads of books written about it. Different nations, different races. The other fun thing was, of course, the fact that all the races didn't necessarily totally get along. The dwarves, of course, and the elves didn't like each other much. But they've actually had wars in the old world. They fought each other. And of course, the humans don't trust the elves, and everybody thinks the halflings are a joke, and so forth and so on. So it's a great deal of fun. So like I say, currently it's in its 3rd edition, and it's also these games, the same basic mechanics and stuff spawned. Now there are 3 40K for the 40K science fiction version of the game. 3 versions of that game. One where you play an Inquisitor, one where you play a Rogue Trader, and one where you play Space Marines. Haven't gotten Space Marine yet. It's called Death Watch. It's Dark Heresy, Death Watch, and Rogue Trader. But it looks very cool. So for people who haven't checked it out, the 3rd edition is currently in print. 2nd edition is not terribly hard to find, and the basic rule book of the 1st edition is not that terribly hard to find if you hunt around and you're not too worried about a brand new copy. Back in the 1st edition days, I'll say, just sort of as a side note, there was a campaign published called The Enemy Within, which was a series of 3 or 4 modules that led through this whole thing about finding cultists within the Empire and all this stuff and trying to root them out. Many people in the RPG business, many people who do reviews and things like that, many people who've played it over the years, and who've been playing RPGs for years and years and years, and going back 10, 20, 30 years, often consider the Enemy Within campaign the greatest RPG adventure campaign ever written for any game, any system, ever. It's considered by many people to be the absolute top of the list. I only own 1 or 2 pieces, and if you can get all the modules that go with Enemy Within off of eBay, I think good luck, because they can be hundreds of dollars. They're highly collectible. I wish I owned them. I don't. But I want to say that there was a lot of fantastic writing going on about it. And if you haven't checked out Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay and you enjoy those slightly less epic, less Lord of the Rings heroic, clean kind of RPGs, and you want to try something a little bit more down and dirty, a little bit more Cthulhu-like, maybe even, because there's a lot of that whole horror aspect to it. Though it is not actually a horror game per se. You could play it that way, but that's not how it's designed out of the box. Definitely check out Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. It's a great old school game. Still maintained a lot of old school feel even in the later edition. Like I say, I can't really speak at the experience for 3rd, but it's a heck of a lot of fun. And I just was reading a few things about it and looking over some of my old books and just felt like talking about it. So there you have it, Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. Awesome stuff. Check it out if you haven't. That's all for now.